Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 65. This is the second episode of shorter stories that I find interesting, but might not be fit for a full episode. Some are histories like usual, and a couple others are articles from older newspapers or trade magazines. Those ones I might just read the full story. There are 6 for us today. Number 1, Hotaling, a Riddle in Whiskey. Number 2, Stocktons 700-foot Grape Vine. Number 3, The People vs. Lee Chuck. Number 4, Babbling Brook of Wine. Number 5, the Malaguerra Winery. Number 6, How to Care for Your Wines. A quick reminder that there's a Patreon at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast. Link is in the show notes also. Any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free and available for everyone is appreciated. Telling a friend is a great way to help out also. Here we go. The first one up is the story of Hotaling, a Riddle in Whiskey. This is one of the more famous San Francisco and earthquake fire stories from 1906. I thought about including it in the Calamity Edition episode number 59 from the CWA series, but didn't want to sidetrack things any more than usual. I think I found a couple fun things that give it a good twist that maybe aren't included in the usually told story. A Riddle in Whiskey. The only things in a bottle of A.P. Hotaling's Old Kirk are pure whiskey and satisfaction. That's how the flagship product of the A.P. Hotaling Company was marketed. The Hotaling building was one of the more infamous stories in the aftermath of the calamity. Building was located near Montgomery Street off of Jackson. There's still a Hotaling place there today, named after Anson Parsons Hotaling, or A.P. Hotaling. By 1906, it was his sons who ran the business. That alley, the oldest in San Francisco, marks part of the original city's water line. At the time of the earthquake, the warehouse was filled with 3,000 barrels of whiskey. Most of it would have been their trademark Old Kirk whiskey, named after their longtime employee, Tom Kirkpatrick, the oldest working whiskey man in the city. He was known as Old Pokey in his youth for his business is business attitude. Advertisements for this whiskey are everywhere in papers at the time. Anyways, no place held more booze on the West Coast. Following the earthquake, the manager Edward Lind had been busy directing his employees on hosing down the building with water from one of San Francisco's cisterns. The U.S. Army was intent on saving government buildings when they could. As we heard in episode 59, in the aftermath of the earthquake, hundreds of buildings were dynamited to create fire breaks, but this usually resulted in even more fires. Lind had learned that the Hotaling building was soon up on the list of buildings to be dynamited. Its proximity to the appraiser's office meant it was a risk to that building. This wasn't its first close call. A fireman had chopped off some of the smoldering Italianate cornices from the threatened building already. Those swirling winds of the San Francisco fire striking here as well. Hotaling employees remained busy soaking the building. Tom Kirkpatrick took over the supervision. Lind worked his magic and was able to convince the officers that the explosion with the volatility of all that whiskey would also destroy the appraiser's building next door. A mile-long fire hose was soon laid from Fisherman's Wharf through North Beach into this area that would be known as Jackson Square. About 11 blocks. They hooked it up to a Navy fire ship out in the bay. With the Army's help, a gang of men were soon hired to pull most of the 3,000 barrels to safety. They had 1,200 of them the first day, all rolled out of the warehouse by their mixed lot of men. Lind's men had pistols to protect them from looters. Luckily, some of the would-be looters were the ones hired to roll the barrels out of the warehouse. This first day was relatively easy as far as rolling full whiskey barrels away from approaching fire goes. Some men stayed overnight, wetting the barrels occasionally to protect from flying embers. The second day was tougher. Most had to be lowered out with a rope and pulley system. To increase production, the prohibition order was lifted so the men could have some beer to get them working faster as the fires raged on. Some barrels broke. This is a good bonus for those onlookers that had a bucket handy. 1,000 more were moved by noon. A safecracker they hired was able to rescue the company's papers from destruction. As the fire got closer, the orders were given to bolt up the metal shutters of the building. They used water from the nearby excavation for a new customs house, and the sewage from a building next door when their cistern supply ran out. A pump was donated from E.A. Grosinger of the A. Fink's Widow Wine House to speed up the process. The hired gang of workers began a new bucket brigade to dump a sewage and saltwater mix onto the barrels still in the warehouse and onto the side of the building. The smell was nauseating as it hit the steaming sides of the structure. After all this important work was done, the men were ordered to save the records from the appraiser's office. That wind that caused so much destruction ended up being the saving grace of both buildings. Shifts of the afternoon wind turned the fire back, and all was well for the Hotaling building. It's memorialized in the poem on a plaque on Hotaling Street by Charles Kellogg Field, later the editor of Sunset magazine. If, as they say, God spanked the town for being over frisky, why did he burn the churches down and save Hotaling's whiskey? This was the only whiskey in the city that survived. The original last line was a reference to Old Pokey, Tom Kirkpatrick, but was changed by the Hotalings later. The nearby Mariners Church at Sacramento and Drum Streets was totally destroyed in the calamity. This was a place of worship for the sailors that were continually embarking and disembarking from the bay, but also a home base of sorts, a place where they could meet, exchange information. It had reading and writing rooms and became a social hall between services. The Hotalings offered their blending room for use by the church and Reverend Rowell in the days following the quake. The Hotalings were known to be more spiritual than religious and chalked up the saving of their building to providence. They continued selling the saved whiskey in the days after the calamity, but only by coin, noting that checks and exchanges are useless in the town at this time. The Hotaling buildings continued to be of good use over the years. The Hotaling Annex West operated during the 1930s as a home for the Works Project Administration's writers and artists. The St. Francis Hotel also supplied a fun short story of the earthquake. A terrier named Francis was pulled from the burned-out and crumbled wine cellar 5 days after the earthquake in perfect condition, except really hungry. He became a short-lived mascot of sorts for the resilience of the people in San Francisco. Our next story is one I found in an article about a special mission vine in Stockton, California. Grape vine of 700 feet yields half-ton. Stockton, October 8th. What local experts call the largest and most profitable grapevine in the state has been discovered on the ranch of Asa Van Valkenburg, who lives northeast of Acampo in the San Loam country. It is a mammoth mission vine, and this year alone produced close upon a half-ton of grapes. The actual weight being 961 pounds, which sold to the local winery at $11 per ton, netting the grower $6.72 from the vine. This is an exceptional record. The vine is trellised upon a fence, one branch extending 700 feet from the main stalk. Every indication is that the soil for a distance around the big vine is of a peculiar composition and will produce a mammoth vineyard by the end of 2 more seasons. I'm not sure if that vineyard ever got any larger. Our third story is an interesting old San Francisco court case from 1886. This one is very wine adjacent, but I found it interesting. The first part took place about 3 or 4 blocks from our Hotaling story. Charles Sullivan, in his book about Zinfandel, alludes to it. Here's the full story as far as I can tell. The People vs. Lee Chuck. July 28, 1886. San Francisco. Most places would be hot this time of year, but usually not San Francisco. It was around noon, and Lee Chuck stood on the corner of Washington and Spofford Alley, right in the heart of San Francisco's Chinatown. Right in the heart of San Francisco, really. Only a couple blocks from where the first American flag was planted in the town of Yerba Buena. Lee Chuck was known as a highbinder by the police, or a hatchet man. These were the foot soldiers and the Chinese tongs of the time. The hatchet man name came from their weapon of choice for assassinations. The hatchet was silent and made bodies easy to dispose of. By now, most used guns also, and Lee Chuck was no exception. He carried 4 of them on him now. Instead of the swing of the special short-handled hatchet, It was now the shot to the lower back of their victims that was favored. Colt revolvers were the weapon of choice for this new age of hatchet men, and that's what Lee Chuck carried, amongst a couple others. A double and a single-barreled horse pistol, along with short-range and long-range revolvers, completed his arsenal. In case the 4 pistols weren't defense enough, he also wore a heavy shirt of chainmail woven from small steel links, about 35 pounds of them. This was under his regular shirt. He had already been shot 9 times in his life and wasn't trying to make it 10. His fellow Geese Sincere Society members loitered around him. Lee Chuck was also the bodyguard for Little Pete, the man who started this tong and one of the most powerful men in Chinatown. Competing tong member and cigar maker Yin Wen was the target. Yin Wen was walking down Washington, most likely on his way for a bite to eat. He had what was later described as a huge 5-chamber blunderbuss holding 50 caliber bullets concealed on him. There are a couple ways this might have gone down. Accounts differ. All the witnesses that came forward were aligned with one of the 2 main men, and the stories of each side's members were very similar and differed wildly from the other side's. It might have happened that a shootout broke out right there on Washington Street near high noon like the Old West. Yin Wen firing first, of course, and then Lee Chuck and his compatriots firing back. Somewhere along the way, Yin Wen was shot and killed. Lee Chuck was lucky he had worn his chainmail and brought his 4 pistols that day. The way it more likely went down was that Yin Wen was walking along Washington Street at noon, and as he approached Lee Chuck and his crew, he was fired upon, hit a few more times after he collapsed, his 2 friends scattering. It wasn't a quiet time in the area. Groups of people were all over the streets, and now they gathered around Yin Wen's motionless body as Lee Chuck fled. 2 officers around the corner were dealing with some trash in front of a house as the shots rang out. The first officer ran towards the scene and passed Lee Chuck as he was putting the still-warm pistol underneath his shirt. As Officer Martin pursued him, yelling, Lee pulled out the double-barrel long-range horse pistol from under his shirt and proceeded to fire at the officers over his shoulder. The first barrel was out of bullets by now, and in the commotion, the second barrel's hammer couldn't be reached. Officer O'Sullivan finally caught up with Lee Chuck by the next block, tackling him on the sidewalk at Pike Street. Chow Hin was the star witness for the prosecution and friends with the deceased also. Together, they were members of the Bo Sincere Society, a competing tong. There had been attempts recently to settle the ongoing disputes and have more peace between the 2 groups. Some disagreements over women had brought the war back recently, and a lottery game gone wrong stepped it up to murderous levels. Lee Chuck and others met in a cemetery to perform a ritual of cutting a chicken's head off and burning certain pieces of paper, and the determination was made that Yin Wen had to go. Chow Hin and others had apparently attacked Lee Chuck the day before, a couple blocks away on Jackson Street. They had threatened him too. There was definitely animus, as Lee Chuck's attorney put it. Yin Wen might have even drawn a pistol on Lee Chuck the day before. The trial commenced, Lee Chuck's lawyer arguing self-defense the entire way. Little Pete would be caught up in the trial as well when he attempted to bribe some officers and jurists. It was supposedly Christopher Buckley who set these bribes up, and Little Pete was set to expose Buckley. The 2 men were well known to each other. When Little Pete attempted to double-cross Buckley, Buckley instead triple-crossed Little Pete, and Pete was transferred to Folsom Prison. When he returned a few weeks later to give his testimony, he no longer had much to say. If you remember back to episode 42 when Christopher Buckley was described as, quote, the blind white devil, well, it was Little Pete who came up with that nickname. Buckley, of course, was no man of great honor. Lee Chuck was found guilty of murder in the 1st degree. There were elevators to the crime, including that he was lying in wait. All this added up to death for Lee Chuck, who would soon be hanged. This wasn't his first brush with the law. A few years earlier, he had gotten out of a 7-year sentence at San Quentin after requesting a new trial. Lee's lawyer appealed the case on a few grounds. Number 1, Chowhan, when called by the prosecution, noted that he had known Lee for a couple years before and could point him out. Quote, "Several years ago, because it was on the last 6 months, 28 days that he killed Yin Wen, and I knew about him a year before," unquote. Hin had a different story the night of the crime and seemed to forget some of the other info he gave that night. 2. The lawyer also objected to how the assistant district attorney noted that warrants had been issued the same day to some of Lee's fellow Tong members, thus poisoning the minds of the judge and jury. Number 3. Jury misconduct. A couple types. The first being that members of the jury had inspected the crime scene without being accompanied by an officer. A much more serious charge is that jury members had been drinking Zinfandel. Deliberations had begun around 3:30 in the afternoon, and by 6:50, no agreement had been reached. A bailiff and sheriff took them around the corner for a French dinner. They, of course, had the house meal, including wine. 6 bottles of claret between the 12 of them, plus a half bottle of cognac. They were at the restaurant for about an hour. Upon returning to deliberation, it was noted by multiple witnesses that the appearances and conduct of at least some of the jurors were consistent with drinking, quote, intoxicating liquors. Affidavits by the jury were consistent in promising their intellect, judgment, and fairness were unaffected. San Francisco's Attorney General naturally sided with the jury, arguing the wine was only a California claret, and the cognac was only used to flavor their after-dinner coffee. California claret might not lead you to expect Zinfandel, but oftentimes it was. There could be some Cabernet or other so-called Medocs blended in, but the taste was generally of Zinfandel. It's been theorized that the familiar taste of Zinfandel is what would help it through Prohibition in the hands of winemakers. Well-aged California Zinfandel can taste remarkably like well-aged Cabernet, but this was a different thing. When the restaurateur was called to testify, he noted, quote, said claret wine was a good quality of California Zinfandel wine. 4 years of age, unquote. This was a man with over 10 years in the restaurant business and, quote, great experience with wines and their effect, unquote. He declared it absurd that such a small amount of wine between 12 men and cognac for coffee flavoring would affect their judgment in any meaningful way. Lee wasn't hanged, but was sent to San Quentin on a 50-year sentence. It gets confusing at this point because some newspaper articles say he was in fact hanged in 1890, but most others have this following story that was clearly printed later. Apparently somewhere along the way he had a mental breakdown and was sent to the Agnews Insane Asylum in Santa Clara. The governor of California pardoned Lee Chuck in 1904 on the condition he be deported. They did try to send him back to China on a ship who refused to accept him. He was sent back to Agnews. During the 1906 earthquake, the worst damage in Santa Clara Valley happened here, where buildings collapsed and 117 patients and staff died. I don't know if Lee Chuck was among those, and that's kind of the last we know about it. Our first short story episode included a great Prohibition wine story, and here's another one. This time we're in Sonoma instead of the Santa Cruz Mountains. River of wine runs on Sunday. Many take drink. More wine poured from the tanks on Fopiano Ranch. A river of wine ran down the ditch from the Fopiano Ranch toward the creek between the property and that of the Comiskey Ranch adjoining on Sunday, on orders of the federal authorities. And the process was of some cause of hilarity among Ottawists who stopped to view the strange sight. Notwithstanding that the wine is souring and has a very strong sour smell, it is reported that 30 or 40 people, both men and women, could be observed at one time quaffing the liquid which they scooped as one might scoop water from a babbling brook. Impromptu charlestons and songs of festivity were staged on the highway in celebration of the waste of jazz fluid as the volunteer sponges began to get the kick from the fermented product of the vine. Today, little pools of red wine still stand in the ditch, while everybody who passes on the highway cannot evade the wonderfully sour smell which arises therefrom. So, that's a good story about some ditch wine. We're going to talk a little about an old Santa Clara Valley winery. I used to ride my bike around the ruins of it as a child because my grandfather's property backed up to it, just separated by Coyote Creek. It's representative of a certain type of country winery that existed in the second half of the 1800s and is probably the oldest example of winery ruins in the Santa Clara Valley. It's the Malaguerra Winery. The Malaguerra Winery was built in 1869 by Jose Maria Malaguerra, a Swiss immigrant to California. He and his wife Alvina had already been cultivating grapes in the area for over 10 years when they were able to acquire a little over 200 acres of the Rancho Laguna Seco land grant for $1,000. This was the first commercial winery in this area of the southern Santa Clara Valley. The Fisher family from whom they purchased the land was a real California pioneer family. Arriving from Boston by way of Mexico, on the way their original ship was wrecked. They finally arrived in 1846. One member helped write the first state constitution in Monterey, and another was postmaster and owned various buildings in the nearby town of Coyote. It was a busy little town at the time with a stop on the overland mail route. The Malaguerras built a home and winery and planted grapes and tomatoes. I can't think of a better place to grow tomatoes. Grapes grow pretty good here too. The foothills of the Diablo Range come sloping down, finishing right around where the winery sits. This was the town of Madrone, adjacent to Coyote in the southern part of the Santa Clara Valley. A large portion of the land here was once owned by Peter Burnett, California's first elected governor, who by all accounts was a horrible human being with a level of racism that is shocking. Madrone was eventually annexed by the town of Morgan Hill. Just across this narrow part of the valley where the mountain pass leading to Watsonville starts, El Toro looms large. This is the largest peak in Morgan Hill and was named by author Bret Harte after he was apparently chased back down the mountain by two fighting bulls at the summit. The basalt rubble stone used to construct the winery is rare in this area, but luckily the nearby Coyote Creek has an abundance of it. It was quarried for construction of the 22 by 24 foot main building. Everything was stuccoed, and when construction was finished and their initials carved into the stucco, it provided a nice finishing touch. The building was 2 stories, but with those foothills sloping down, both levels could be entered from ground level. No interior staircase existed. The bottom level was a basement and winery, and the top level was the family home. When construction was started, there were only 26 other wineries in the Santa Clara Valley. 140 acres was the average vineyard size, so Malaguerra would likely be right around that average. Not much is known of the actual functioning and operation of the winery. It was in use until 1898, and it's been said that its downfall was the wine wars, where prices dropped to unsustainably low levels. The property has had some changes over the years. In 1904, an adjoining structure was added, and also a barn. At one point, the buildings were converted to a chicken shack, probably in the 1920s. It continued operating as a winery until the 1950s. The Malaguerra Winery was placed on the National Register of Historic Places on October 23, 1980. The Friends of Winemakers group attempted for years to turn it into a nonprofit museum focused on the Santa Clara Valley winemaking tradition. This last one is an article I read. It's advice for people on how to care for their wines that were purchased in bulk in pre-Prohibition California. If you purchase bottles at your local shop or from your favorite winery, it's not something you'd even think about now. The Italian Swiss colony found it important enough to write about, though. How to care for wines. In an interview the other day, the superintendent of the wine cellars of the Italian Swiss colony declared that 1/2 of the wines used by inexperienced people in the United States is partly spoiled before it reaches their lips, just because they do not observe a few simple but important precautions. Continuing, he said, "Those who secure wine by the demijohn should immediately put it in absolutely clean bottles, and above all, have new, soft corks free from musty nut holes. Before the corks are used, they should be soaked in warm water for a few minutes, and a little wine dropped in the water will make the cork safer. To ensure clearness in bottled wines, they should be bottled in clear weather. This especially applies to white wines. The bottles should be placed in the bins in the cellar with their noses inclined, if anything a little downward, in order to be sure the corks are always kept moistened. Those who do not use large quantities should procure their wines already bottled, thus saving themselves a great deal of annoyance and the danger of spoiling by improper bottling. Quote, all pure wines after traveling require rest before using. Therefore, the cask on arrival should be placed on its side in a cool place for at least a week. A wooden faucet should be put in the head, preparatory to drying the wines, which should run through the faucet without bubbling, as this brings the sediment from the bottom to the body of the wine. The bottle should be filled to within about 2.5 inches from the aperture of the neck. It often happens that those who are inexperienced in the handling and care of wines will draw off only a small portion of the barrel of dry wine because they are short of smaller packages, kegs, demijohns, or bottles. If the wines are absolutely pure and free from any antiseptic or preservative, they will naturally, on being exposed to the air, turn sour. Sweet wines, on the other hand, being of a higher alcoholic strength, are not as easily affected. When a cask of dry wine, Claret, Zinfandel, Burgundy, Carignan, Cabernet, Hock, Riesling, Chablis, or Sauterne is popped, all the wine must be removed in small packages, which should be scrupulously clean, kept full and laid flat, so that the wine will be free from contact with the air. Under no circumstances should a part of the wine be left in the barrels or demijohns, or it will spoil quickly. The sweet wines like port, sherry, muscat, angelica, tokay, or madeira may be drawn off as needed. So that's a good lesson on how to care for your wines in the 1890s. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. And feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love it if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast helps too. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses and allows for more episodes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.